In this video, we're going to be talking about the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, and as the name suggests, this act is to provide for the conservation of forest and for matters connected with it. Currently, it extends to the whole of India. Earlier, when Jammu Kashmir was a state and not a union territory, this act could not have Jammu Kashmir under its ambit. It came into force on the 25th October 1980. Before going into the sections and provisions of this particular act, we should know what are reserved forests. A reserved forest or a reserve forest and protected forest in India are terms denoting forests with a certain degree of protection from the government. Now, many areas were designated with these particular terms way back in 1927 when India was still a British colony. Indian Forest Act 1927 during British Raj did the denotement. Land rights to these forests are owned by the Government of India, and a particular area is denoted as reserved forest or protected forest by the state governments. In reserved forest, most of the activities like hunting and grazing are completely banned until and unless the government gives a special authorization for certain communities. In protected areas, on the other hand, there are some rights to activities like hunting and grazing given to forest-dependent communities. The salient features of the Act. If a government, that is a state government, wants to de-reserve a forest, that is, use a particular area of the reserve forest for some other purposes, the state government will have to take prior permission of the central government. We will be talking about the non-forest purposes in further slides. This act also gives power to the government and forest department to create reserve forests newly. This act also created protected forest, that is a forest in which the use of resources by the local people was quite controlled. There were some other forests which were also controlled by the village community, and these forests were to be called village forest under this particular act. In 1992, this act was amended and some provisions were allowed for some non-forest activities in the reserve forest without cutting trees or limited tree cutting with the prior approval of the central government. The section 2 of the act further elaborates the de-reservation of the forest. Now, the section 2 of the act restricts the use of forest land for non-forest purposes. Non-forest purposes would mean the cultivation of tea, coffee, spices, rubber, palms, oil-bearing plants, horticultural crops or medicinal plants, or any other purpose than reforestation. In many of the states across the country, it was a main tendency for people to encroach upon the forest land and cultivate these kind of cash crops, degrading the natural habitat of the forest. This particular act tries to put a stop to it. This act also tries to prevent the de-reservation of forests that have been reserved. It wants to restrict leasing of forest land to private individuals, authority, corporations not owned by the government. And also, it tries to prevent clear felling of naturally grown trees in these areas. Some other important provisions of this particular act are the following. Rule-making power. The power to make rules under this act is placed with the central government and not state government. Because of that, the rules, they have to be kept before both houses, that is the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha in the parliament for 30 days at least, so that the state's consents can be hypothetically obtained from the Rajya Sabha. And if a decision made from the authorities under this act has to be appealed, it shall be appealed to the National Green Tribunal. An appeal may be filed by any aggrieved person. Section 3 of this act states that whoever contravenes or abets any provisions of Section 2 of this act shall be punished with a simple imprisonment which may extend up to 15 days. This act subsequently brought in a concept called compensatory afforestation. The idea behind compensatory afforestation is that in 1999, it was said that whatever area was lost under any kind of economic activity will be compensated by afforesting an equal area in a non-forest land. So let's say if you are destroying 100 hectares of forest land for some development purpose, other non-forest area of 100 hectare could be afforested, and that would be compensating for whatever degradation happened. And if non-forest land were not available for this purpose, then degraded forest land could be afforested, but then it has to be double the area which was used for other purposes. This is a flawed idea just by the name of it, because degrading or destroying the natural forest habitat for anything else is not adequate compensation. This is actually one of the important drawbacks, that is the compensatory afforestation concept. Other drawbacks of the acts are the following. The act transferred the power of the state governments to the central government. There is a very strong centralizing tendency here. The act also failed to attract public support, especially from forest dependent communities who uses resources from the forest for their livelihood. And native people did not like this kind of encroachment upon their livelihood. Generally, the scope of public participation was not utilized in this particular act. Forest dwellers and tribal communities have very varied and rich knowledge about forests, and none of these traditional knowledge were used in the making of this particular act.